Start recording. And we'd like to thank our corporate sponsors, and you can see them here on the slide. Diamond level is PW Grosser, and Topaz level, we have 6 different corporate sponsors this year in 2022. Alpha Analytical, Castleton Environmental, EnviroTrack, ERM, H2M, and Island Pump and Tank. And we thank all of our sponsors for their contributions. They help keep our program running, help pay for things like insurance and the website and a number of other things that we need to do just to have this organization in the form that it currently is. So thank you again. If anybody's not familiar with these organizations, you can go to our webpage and there's a scrolling banner. And if you click on their logo, it will take you to their website and you can learn more about them. So thanks. The LIAPG has been having these Zoom meetings for the last 2 years, and we try to have one every month. Usually it's the third Thursday of every month. And, we took a little bit of a hiatus during the summer here, but we wanted to have this one really as an enrichment activity for the upcoming canoe trip and picnic on the Nissaqua River. This presentation has been approved for PDH credit by the New York State Council of Professional Geologists, which act as proxy to review and approve things for the State Education Department. And so, as I said earlier, maybe not everybody was on the phone yet, but we are looking for speakers for September, October, November, and December. If anyone here has a presentation or a topic that they'd be interested in presenting, we would welcome it. It's always a challenge for the LIAPG board to find, speakers and good content. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Bret Bennington, has been gracious enough to make presentations more than once over the last several years, and they're always excellent. So, enough about that. The board we're an open organization. The board meets monthly, is generally the first Monday of every month, although in September that happens to be Labor Day. So we moved it up to the 29th of August. That's a Monday coming up at the end of the month. And, if anybody's interested in getting involved or just wants to know what goes on, reach out to us. You can email us and we'll include you with an invite to the Zoom meeting, which we've been doing. We are looking to move back to in-person meetings with a Zoom online component if someone doesn't want to be in an in-person setting, but we're here. A little bit about our sister organizations and some upcoming events. The New York State Council for Professional Geologists has 2 things coming up that you probably saw an email blast about already. The first is on the 8th of September. It's a concert. Called Geology Rocks, and it's at the Coliseum in White Plains. It's a cover band for The Fish, and you can go to the council's website or look up the LIAPG email blast, and you can find a link there to find out more about it. And then the second thing that's going on to promote the profession of geology in New York State is what's called Geology Days in October. And it's the 17th through the 19th. And that really equates to, a mix or a meet and greet on the 17th, and then 2 days of presentations and conference sessions. It should probably result in, if in full attendance, you could probably acquire somewhere between 8 and 12 PDH credits that most of us will be needing in the next year or two. When you renew your PG license, you'll have to produce those PDH credits on a sliding scale that you can look up on the SED website that has a table there. For example, I have to renew in January and I need to show 12 credits to renew my license. As far as the other organizations listed here, Buffalo, Central New York, HUMCA, and Northeast American Institute of Professional Geologists, they all follow a summer hiatus schedule. So when I looked at their website today, they didn't have any events listed, but there are similar programs to what we do here going on there, and there's always good stuff. So I would encourage you to visit their websites and check them out. Usually some good presentations and lectures going on. Similarly, in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Council usually has a bunch of good programs. They only have one listed right now, and it's about Pennsylvania setting forth maximum contaminant levels for PFAS in groundwater. They have been doing an ongoing program for the last few months, and it was a 6 or 8 webinar series, and it was for people who wanted to prep for the ASBOG exam. I think that's almost over. The next ASBOG exam is in October. You can also check out the Geology Open Night Lecture Series at Stony Brook University. They don't have their fall schedule up yet, but there tend to be some pretty neat topics there too. So you can check that out. There's a list here of the next ASBOG exam dates, which are in now. Registration and application deadline for the October 2022 exam series is closed. So your next opportunity would be in March or in October of 2023. And the application deadlines are shown there. You can find out more about it on their website, www.asbog.org. And lastly, there you will see, as well as on our employment tab on the LIAPG website, New York State DEC is hiring geologists, both upstate and downstate. So if that's something that is attractive to you, you can find out more information through the links on the LIAPG website. Looking for people in Suffolk, Long Island City, and several locations across upstate New York, anywhere from entry level to, a professional geologist type, 10-year experience and up. So check it out. That's all the administrative stuff. Tonight's presentation is going to be from Dr. Bret Bennington from Hofstra, and it's going to be on the streams of Long Island. As I said, it's an enrichment, activity, in advance of our canoe kayaking trip with a picnic. There is a code in the upper right-hand corner, LIAPG-214. It would be appreciated if everyone could just type that into the chat box to demonstrate your attendance at this time. And at the end of the presentation, we'll ask for that again, and we'll have 3 questions that we'll be looking for people to provide some answers. Again, the purpose of it is that we have to provide some sort of documentation to the New York State Council, who records everybody's PDH credits and has them available to the state. When you go to renew, they will check the database that's being established for that. So if you could just cooperate with that, it would be very much appreciated.
Can I just put in 1 second, Chris?
Of course, Jen.
If you do not have your name displayed or you're using somebody else's computer, make sure you include your name with your chat message.
Yes, and there's one person showing right now. It says iPad. That might be Ivy. I'm not sure.
It is Ivy, and she did already put her name in.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I've seen that before, and that's important. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, stop talking, and turn this over to Bret, who will be much more interesting.
Chris,
So
I'm sorry, Chris, before you do that, I was having some connectivity issues. Where do we put that code again?
You put it in the chat box.
In the chat box. Okay, thank you very much.
Yep. All right, I'm stopping sharing. Bret, pick up where I left off.
Okay, no problem. Before I start sharing my screen, I just want to thank you all for coming today and for giving a listen. I hope I have some enlightening and entertaining information to share. The canoe trip down the Nissaqua, which this talk is supporting, is one of my favorite trips. I've done it with LIAPG a couple of times before. I take students on this canoe trip, and I'm really sorry I can't do it this year, but I'm taking daughter number 2 down to college to get her started on her freshman year. down to Florida next week. So I'm not going to be able to do the trip. But I'm happy to talk about the Nissaqua River, and we're going to talk about rivers in general on Long Island. One of the courses I teach at Hofstra is a geomorphology course. So I won't pretend to be an expert on geomorphology or on streams, but I have thought about it a bit. So I think there's some interesting things to say, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. So let me share my screen here, and give it a second to come up. Okay, there we go. All right, so our topic for today is streams of Long Island. And we're gonna start with the basics and then get into some more specifics here. So one thing to mention is that a stream is the generic term that's used by the US Geological Survey for any flowing body of water on the Earth's surface that is confined in a channel. So rivers, creeks, brooks, kills, runs, any other local idiom you can think of, they're all streams. And there's no formal definition for the difference between a river, a creek, a brook, or anything like that. So we're just going to call everything streams for the most part during this presentation. And the photo here, of course, is a photo which I think I may have taken on the last LIAPG trip down the Nissaqua River, but this is a view downstream about midway through the trip. A couple of slides where I'm probably preaching to the choir. Many of you are no doubt hydrologists and understand this, but it's worth mentioning just because it's important background. So we live on an island. Precipitation is where we get our fresh water on Long Island, and our island is made out of sand. So the precipitation that falls on the island, about half of it evapotranspirates back into the atmosphere, and the other half infiltrates. And there's really not much, if any, water that's intercepted by the ground that flows along the surface, except for water that's intercepted by roadways and ends up in storm drains, which may lead to recharge basins or may lead to some of the surface streams on Long Island. Hydrologic modeling has shown that about 60% of the recharge water ends up discharging along the coastline, discharges into the bays around Long Island and Long Island Sound, and about 40% ends up discharging as fresh water back to the surface to supply streams, ponds, lakes, and other wetlands. And on Long Island, all of our streams are essentially what we would call perennial or gain streams, in that they exist because they are fed throughout most of the year by groundwater flow. Although one thing we'll talk about towards the end is because of human interference in the hydrologic system, there are streams on Long Island that become losing streams during part of the year because the water table falls. So just a little graphic to kind of emphasize this idea that streams exist because they occupy valleys where the bottom of the valley intersects the water table, and groundwater is continuously discharging in the valley, and that's why the stream flows. This is something that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, but it's something that almost no one in the public is familiar with. And so when I talk about groundwater and I talk about streams to the public and to students, I always emphasize this point, that there's this intimate connection between the groundwater system and the surface water system. And when we talk about rivers and streams, we typically talk about watersheds, and the watershed concept is simply, you can map the entire area on the surface where all of the streams, the smaller streams, feed into larger streams as tributaries, and eventually feed into a trunk stream or discharge into a larger body of water like Lake Ontario or the Atlantic Ocean. And this defines a watershed. On Long Island, though, it probably makes more sense to talk about groundwater sheds. A groundwater shed is the surface area where all of the water that infiltrates ends up discharging to a particular location. And this is a very interesting map that was produced recently. I forget who made it. Somebody in the audience probably knows. I came in contact with it because we used it to create an interactive display on water on Long Island for the new environmental center at Hempstead Lake State Park. And if you spend some time studying this, it's a really, really interesting map because it basically shows for any part of Long Island, where does the groundwater that infiltrates in that area end up? And a couple of things that are sort of I don't know, surprising. A lot of the surface area of Long Island is collecting recharge water that ends up basically coming out of public supply wells. So this sort of darker orange that kind of runs across many areas of the center of the map, those are areas that are essentially feeding our public supply wells. The very dark orange coloration, which you see in a few areas, again, mostly towards the center of the map, those are elevated areas where you have relatively deep groundwater flow that ends up discharging directly out of the mostly the Magathy aquifer along the coastline. And then other areas which are areas of more shallow groundwater discharge that supply the rivers and streams on Long Island, and then also that discharge into shallow groundwater flow that discharges into the coastal waters. So on Long Island, because Long Island is essentially this big pile of very, very porous sand, you know, the sort of most productive way to think about, you know, what is the fate of water that falls on the surface is to think of, okay, you know, when it infiltrates, where does it end up? And basically, you know, there are three options, right? It comes back to it forms relatively shallow groundwater flow that comes back to the surface and feeds freshwater wetlands and streams, or it's shallow groundwater flow near the coast that discharges into bays, or it's deeper groundwater flow that discharges into the bays and into Long Island Sound. And then of course, a very large source of groundwater discharge is public supply wells, pumped wells. So groundwater is what's feeding streams on Long Island, and you will have a stream, as I mentioned before, wherever the topography intersects the water table. So this is a very informative map to look at. This is a depth to estimated depth from the land surface to the water table map. And essentially the red and pink areas are places where the depth to groundwater is relatively shallow, and the green and brown areas are where the water table is deeper below the surface. And if you observe this map, one of the things that's kind of obvious is that there's not much shallow groundwater on the northern half of Long Island. The shallow groundwater exists very, very close to the coastline. Otherwise, the water table is you know, probably at least 50 feet or so below the land surface. And what this means is that you don't have a lot of valleys on the northern half of Long Island that actually intersect the water table. So we don't have a lot of streams on the northern half of Long Island. Most of our streams are located along the southern half of Long Island, where the groundwater table is much closer to the surface. And that's an effect of Long Island's glacial geomorphology and the fact that the northern half of the island is built up with glacial moraines and elevated thick outwash plains, and it's the southern half to third of Long Island, which are the thinner outwash plains that are less elevated, and so valleys in the southern region of Long Island have a much greater chance of intersecting the water table. So that's one sort of peculiarity of Long Island that we can explain right away. Why are most of the rivers and streams located south of the midline of Long Island relative to the north? And if we look at a map of the streams of Long Island, it's pretty clear. Lots of north-south flowing creeks and brooks and rivers located along the south shore, and very few at all along the north shore. A couple of little, very, very short runs of stream and in the northwestern Long Island, but very, very little that rises to the level of a named creek even. And so if you're curious about, okay, can we explain the origin of streams on Long Island, or is there anything interesting to say about streams on Long Island? We need to think about this question of, well, what is the origin of the valleys that are hosting the streams? Typically we think, well, a stream erodes its own valley, right? You get water discharging at the surface, and it flows along and seeks a lower elevation, and in the process, it erodes the stream valley. Turns out on Long Island that's not always the case, and it may not be the case in most instances. And again, that's because of Long Island's kind of peculiar glacial origin. We probably don't think that much about it, or I don't know, we're all geologists, or most of us are geologists, so maybe we do. But Long Island's a pretty unusual place. It's got some very, very unusual morphologies, topographies compared to other places, and we live on it. We're used to it, and probably don't think about it that much, but it really is kind of unique. So we have these moraines running along the northern part of Long Island. We have another moraine that kind of branches off in Nassau County and sort of forms a spine along the center of the island and the South Fork here. We have these elevated glacial outwash plains between the moraines and to the south of the Ronkonkoma moraine here. We have these steep, narrow valleys, which are ubiquitous north of the Harbor Hill moraine on the western end of the northwestern end of Long Island. These are the tunnel valleys that Gil Hansen has talked about a lot, and we'll revisit in a minute here. And then we have some large shallow valleys that sort of intersect the Ronkonkoma moraine on the eastern part of Long Island, and then lots of very straight kind of very simply branched and narrow valleys that run from south of the Ronkonkoma moraine into the base along the south shore of Long Island. So we have different types of valleys on Long Island, and it's interesting to think a little bit about where these valleys came from, and look at which of them tend to host streams and which of them don't host streams. So in thinking about this, I've decided, and this is an arguable point, but I've decided that there are essentially four kinds of stream valley on Long Island. There are what you might call normal stream valleys, and a normal stream valley would be a valley that has been eroded over time by the stream that occupies that valley. There are tunnel valleys, which were not eroded by streams, but are now occupied by streams. There are glacial outwash channels, which were carved by glacial meltwater, but because they now intersect the water table, they are occupied by streams. And then there are these things called post-glacial dry valleys, which again, Gil Hansen and his students have kind of brought to the world's attention as unusual because they are valleys that were carved, eroded by a different mechanism than just the erosion from the stream that occupies them currently. And we'll talk about that. So in the image on screen here, I've zoomed in on the part of the Nissaqua River Valley and the upper part of the Peconic River Valley. And there's Lake Ronkonkoma highlighted in blue, and the Ronkonkoma moraine kind of running diagonally across the center of the image. And just to kind of show some of these different valley morphology. So it's possible that the Nissaqua River is occupying a tunnel valley. We'll get to that in a minute. The Peconic River appears to be occupying a large, a wide glacial meltwater channel that intersects the Ronkonkoma moraine. There's another potential meltwater channel located to the right of the image, and then a good example of a dry valley, this sort of simply branched valley that has its head south of the Ronkonkoma moraine, but doesn't really intersect the Ronkonkoma moraine. So let's talk a little bit about these different valley morphologies. Oops, I have a few labels that, there we go. Got it, there we go. So tunnel valleys. Some of you have probably already heard about tunnel valleys. Again, Gil Hansen, who's on the call today, has talked a lot about them, and I have to acknowledge him for bringing tunnel valleys to my attention and to everyone else's attention. So a tunnel valley is a valley that is carved not by water flowing across the surface from high elevation to low elevation, not really carved by a stream, but it's a valley that's carved by water flowing through a meltwater tunnel at the base of the ice sheet, under pressure, and often flowing from low elevation to high elevation because of the hydraulic head inside the glacier. And the northwestern part of Long Island is crisscrossed by tunnel valleys. The most prominent tunnel valleys forming these steep, narrow north-south trending valleys that are harbors, and that divide the northwestern part of Long Island into the necks of land. This is a view of the Manhasset and Little Neck peninsulas here. So we can sort of imagine that the glacier at one point was sitting over this part, the northern part of Long Island, and the ice was doing what glaciers do, which is to say it was flowing down from the north and then reaching a point where the rate of melting of the ice matched the rate of ice flow, and that point defines the terminus of the glacier. So there's a lot of dynamism here. The ice is advancing, but it's also melting, and so there's a tremendous amount of water being produced as the glacier is melting near its terminus. Much of that water is being channeled into meltwater tunnels below the ice, and the water flowing along the base of the glacier is carving valleys, and then tremendous quantities of glacial sediments, primarily sand and gravel, are being discharged out of the margin of the ice sheet as that meltwater kind of disgorges, and all that material coalesces into a series of fans and builds up to form a glacial outwash plain. Just got to give the zoom chance to catch up with this slide advancing. Okay. So a series of meltwater tunnels that intersect the trend of the moraine marking the margin of the ice sheet, and these coalescing outwash fans that build up to give us the topography of the northwestern part of Long Island here. And so the tunnel valleys themselves are eroded down into the older coastal plain deposits, the Cretaceous deposits that are beneath the glacial outwash, and then eroded into the glacial outwash itself, into the outwash plain, are kind of wide, shallow channels that were carved by the meltwater flowing out of the tunnel valleys. And there's, in this particular image, there's a pretty good example of a meltwater channel on the right-hand side of the image here. Here's a view of the Northport area showing the main tunnel valleys that were developed trending in the north-south direction. The tunnel valley, the most prominent tunnel valley in the center of the image here is the tunnel valley that's currently occupied by Bread and Cheese Hollow Road. Waterside Avenue is another, oh, I'm sorry, over here. Waterside Avenue is another tunnel valley. Main Street in Northport is a tunnel valley. And then of course, Northport and Centerport Harbors are two tunnel valleys that come together where they breach the moraine. Here's another example of an outwash channel. You can even see in the digital elevation model image here that an older outwash channel was partially filled in by outwash that was being transported in a younger outwash channel. So there's a little cross-cutting relationship there. So these glacial tunnels were probably active at different times, discharging meltwater from beneath the ice in pulses as the outwash plain built up. Just a quick personal note. I grew up in a house right at the top, right at the crest of the moraine here, near Belrose Avenue, and where Belrose Avenue intersects Old Bridge Road. And I spent my childhood riding my bicycle, through these tunnel valleys. And I was always puzzled by the fact that none of the valleys in the Northport area had streams in them. I loved, looking for frogs and things in streams. That was one of my favorite things to do as a kid. And it frustrated me to no end that there were no streams where I was living, even though we had valleys. And I just didn't understand. It really puzzled me as a kid, how can you have a valley without a stream in it? And it wasn't until I started teaching at Hofstra that I found out that the reason why there are no streams is because these aren't stream valleys, they're tunnel valleys. So let's look at some of our larger streams on Long Island. So people typically talk about there being 4 rivers on Long Island: the Nissaqua River, the Peconic River, the Canoe, and the Carmins. And we can ask the question, are any of these rivers good candidates for streams that are occupying a valley that was carved as a tunnel valley? If we pull up the digital elevation view, superimposed here, there we go. We see that, well, the Canoe River and the Carmins River appear to be occupying large meltwater channels, wide, shallow channels that have their origin where there's a gap in the Ronkonkoma moraine. So these appear to be big outwash channels rather than tunnel valleys. The Peconic River is developed in between the moraines in between the Roanoke Point moraine on the North Shore and the Ronkonkoma moraine below. So you have a large area with a central depression. This is sort of just looks like a normal kind of river valley. A large drainage basin feeding into a central valley. The one river that might be a good candidate for a stream that's occupying a tunnel valley is the Nissaqua River, because it has this sort of curving north-south trending channel that might be connected to this this feature here, this kind of S-shaped feature that then continues on and connects up to the outwash channel formed by, or the outwash channel that the Peconic River occupies. So maybe this is a tunnel valley here. To answer that question, and actually one of Gil Hansen's students wrote a paper that was published online as part of the annual conference on the geology of Long Island. Did a study where he looked at stratigraphic sections from wells to see if the glacial deposits in the vicinity of the Nissaqua River were the kind of glacial deposits that you would expect to be associated with a tunnel valley. And if we just superimpose a map of the upper surface of the Cretaceous. Come on, you can do it, zoom. There we go. So if there's a tunnel valley that was produced when the margin of the ice was near or maybe even south of the Ronkonkoma moraine, so when glacial meltwater was flowing across was flowing beneath the ice sheet across what's now central Long Island, that tunnel valley would have eroded down into the surface of the Cretaceous coastal plain deposits. And if we look at the Nissaqua River here, there does not seem to be a tunnel valley associated with the Nissaqua River. There is, however, what appears to be a tunnel valley to the east that maybe connects up with the outwash channel that the Nissaqua River occupies. But it does not appear from this map that the Nissaqua occupies any kind of a tunnel valley. And in fact, the student that did the study under Gil didn't find any evidence in the well logs for the kinds of glacial deposits that you would expect to be exhibited by a tunnel valley. So it doesn't actually appear that the Nissaqua River is occupying a tunnel valley. And notice that the Nissaqua has something in common with the Peconic River. It has a pretty good system of tributaries, which the Carmen's River and the Peconic River lack. And I think that could be one hallmark of a stream that has kind of eroded its own channel versus a stream that is occupying a channel that was bequeathed to it by some other process. It's the presence of a good network of tributaries. So I would argue that the Nissaqua River is most similar to the Peconic River in that it has simply developed in an area where there's a large enough drainage basin to funnel a supply of shallow groundwater, into a network of tributaries and a stream. So one question we can ask is, well, are there any good examples of a stream on Long Island that occupies a tunnel valley? And the answer, I think, is not really. There's arguably one stream that is a good candidate for a tunnel valley stream, and that's and it's not a very impressive stream. It's the stream that flows down towards Cold Spring Harbor. It's called Cold Spring Brook, and it is certainly occupying at least the northern reach of the stream is occupying the tunnel valley that intersects the Harbor Hill moraine here. But really, I think this is the only good example. And again, the reason for this is all the other tunnel valleys are just too far above the water table and they, you know, there's just not much of a drainage basin. You've got the crest of the moraine is pretty close to the shoreline, and you know, once you're south of the crest of the moraine, the drainage is in the opposite direction. So you know, all of these tunnel valleys, which could potentially host streams, just aren't intersecting the water table and don't have any flow. So the answer is there are really no good examples, I think, of tunnel valley streams. I think we can rule out the Nissaqua and okay, Cold Spring Brook. That's pretty much it. Now, what about the rest of the streams on Long Island? All of these streams which have their headwaters south of the Ronkonkoma moraine, and then or you know, in the southern part of the Hempstead Plains area, and then make their way into the bays along the South Shore. Well, one of the interesting things about these streams is that at least the current streams that are in these valleys do not occupy the entire extent of the valley. So what I've done on this image here is I've marked with push pins the headwaters of a whole bunch of streams in Nassau County, you know, where those headwaters were located. Not necessarily right now, but I looked at some old atlases. So, you know, going back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, before we started to have a huge impact on the water table in Western Long Island from groundwater pumping. So I kind of take these locations to be, you know, sort of the pre-development location for these streams' headwaters. And in all cases, the headwaters of the streams are not where the stream valleys begin. The stream valleys extend further north towards the Ronkonkoma, or towards the northern part of the outwash plain. So geologists refer to these stream valleys as dry valleys because they are dry for a significant stretch of their extent. And again, a nod to Gil Hansen and his students, in this case, a student named Soma Sen, who worked out a very nice explanation for these dry valleys. And the explanation is that the valleys were initially eroded when the water table was much higher than it is today, and much higher than it's been for thousands of years, because there was permafrost shortly after deglaciation, and the permafrost created a perched, essentially a widespread perched water table across Long Island that allowed streams through groundwater sapping to begin eroding these valleys. And then when the permafrost melted, the water table dropped and these valleys became dry, except in their southern extents where they intersect the post-glacial water table. So we have lots of examples of dry valleys. They have a very distinctive morphology of a sort of a fairly straight central trunk, and then very simple tributary valleys, which are occupied, if at all, by short stretches of stream, mostly in the southern extent of the valley. So that's my rationale for recognizing these 4 different types of stream valleys. The normal valleys generated by fluvial erosion, I think the Nissaqua and the Peconic River are good candidates. Tunnel valleys that are occupied by modern streams, very few good examples of that. Glacial outwash channels that are occupied by streams, certainly the Canoe and the Carmen's River are good examples of those. And then again, lots of post-glacial dry valleys, all of these creeks that flow from mid-island to the south there. Oops. Okay, so I mean that's my main message on sort of the geomorphology of streams on Long Island. As I said, it certainly could be argued, I think, but I think it's a good story. Now I want to talk just briefly a bit about the human impacts that we've had on Long Island streams, and this is a slide that I show my students to kind of get the conversation started about groundwater. One question everybody has is, you know, are we using groundwater? Are we using up our groundwater supply? Are we using groundwater sustainably? And most people interpret that question as, well, are we in danger of sucking the aquifers dry? And I try and involve them in a discussion that introduces the idea that, in fact, we're not draining the aquifers, that we're probably intercepting about 30% of the total amount of groundwater recharge and pumping it out of our wells. We're not intercepting 100% of recharge. We're not intercepting 120% of recharge. So we aren't draining the aquifers, but that's not the whole story. Just because we're allowing the aquifers to replenish themselves, even though we're siphoning off a significant amount of the precipitation that falls on Long Island and gets into the aquifers, doesn't mean that everything is hunky-dory. And that's because, of course, groundwater isn't just a big reservoir of water sitting under Long Island waiting for somebody to do something with it. Groundwater is constantly in motion, and it's moving underground, and it's coming back to the surface, either as base flow to supply our rivers and streams and wetlands, or as subsea outflow along the shoreline. And I point out to my students that it's the outward flow of fresh water towards the shoreline that prevents the inward flow of salt water from infiltrating into our aquifers and contaminating our water supply. So you need that outflow. And then, if you want to have wetlands, freshwater wetlands, you need the base flow. And this diagram just kind of takes the 48 inches of precipitation that Long Island receives every year and divides it up into proportions that represent the different components of the water budget on Long Island. And then I point out that, okay, we're pumping the equivalent of those 48 inches that fall on Long Island. We are pumping the equivalent of 7 inches. And if you take those 7 inches back out of the ground, if that water is consumptively lost, if it doesn't get back into the system, then you are going to reduce the amount of water that flows out into the bays, which is going to allow the salt water to begin to move in a little bit, and that you are reducing the amount of water that's feeding our freshwater wetlands across Long Island. So you can't. There's no such thing as a free lunch. If we're if you're diverting groundwater, you are stealing that water from the other destinations that it would normally have. You know, in Suffolk County, there are about 600 public supply wells, pump about 210 million gallons per day. There is a large sewer district in the southwestern part of Suffolk County. So about 95 million gallons per day are lost through sewers, through you know, discharge of treated wastewater, lawn sprinkling, other marine discharges. But a significant amount of the water that's used in Suffolk County is recharged to the aquifer via septic systems. Of course, that has its own problem with nitrogen contamination. But if you add it all up, it turns out that about 10% of the total groundwater recharge in Suffolk County is being lost to the system because it's ending up in the ocean or it's evaporating away. So that's pretty good, right? And again, the reason why the consumptive loss is relatively low in Suffolk County is because so much of the waste of the water that we pump is being put back into the upper glacial aquifer through septic systems. Of course, this creates problems with nitrogen pollution, which are having a tremendous impact on our surface water bodies. But if we look at Nassau County, about 400 public supply wells, 180 million gallons pumped per day. Of the 180 million gallons per day pumped, 140 million gallons per day is lost as sewage outflow into the bays and the ocean, because almost all of Nassau County, or at least population-wise, most people in Nassau County are connected up to municipal sewer systems. We do a lot of lawn sprinkling in Nassau County too, and much of that water evaporates away, so it's consumptively lost. So if you add it all up, whereas in Suffolk County, there's about 10% of total recharge is consumptively lost. In Nassau County, about 55%. More than half of recharge is lost. And that's had a tremendous impact on the hydrologic system in Nassau County, lowering the water table, which has decreased the amount of base flow to streams and dried up a lot of wetlands in Nassau County. Created problems with saltwater intrusion, particularly on the, of course, on the north and south shores. It's relieved the problem of nitrogen pollution in the aquifer. We're not putting much nitrogen in the aquifer in Nassau County. Most of that waste nitrogen is ending up in the ocean or in the bays. So Nassau and Suffolk County are kind of sort of two sides of a coin because of the difference in the amount of sewering that's been done. Suffolk County hasn't seen a huge impact on discharge to wetlands, but the discharge, except for the fact that discharge tends to be contaminated with nitrogen, Nassau County has seen tremendous impact on its wetlands because of the lowering of the water table. So this is a graph showing hydraulic head in a well, in a monitoring well in Nassau County. You can see that the hydraulic head values were hovering around 68 feet above sea level until the mid 1950s, and they start to fall. And by the 1970s, they've dropped down to 48 or so. So again, that's a 20-foot decrease in the level of the water table. And it's from the mid 50s to the 70s that the population of Nassau County explodes. So you have, that's when you see tremendous amount of new public supply wells. And also that's when Nassau County was sewered. So pumping more groundwater, and then that groundwater is ending up being discharged into the bays, and it's not recharged to the system. This is a wonderful graph that was from a study by Rosell et al. This published again online as was given at the Long Island Geologist Conference. And it shows the history of base flow recorded in a whole bunch of these streams that drain from south of the Ronkonkoma moraine to the southern bays. I've highlighted the 3 streams in Nassau County. So that's Valley Stream in blue, Pines Brook, which flows from West Hempstead down to Oceanside in red, and East Meadowbrook, which flows along the Meadowbrook Parkway in green. And you can see that there was a tremendous loss of base flow, particularly in Valley Stream and Pines Brook, in the, starting in the 1950s and extending into the 1970s. Been a little bit of recovery of base flow at the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century, and that's probably because of a reduction in groundwater pumping in Queens. The groundwater doesn't recognize the Queens-Nassau border, so there's been a little bit of recovery of the water table. But certainly not a complete recovery. And the rest of the streams in Suffolk County, there's been some impact, but not nearly as much as in Nassau County. And not surprisingly, the further east the stream is, the less impact there's been, because you have less population as you head east on Long Island. So here's 2 photos of Brook near my West Hempstead. One photo taken in the late spring when the water table is relatively high. The other photo I took 2 days ago. We've been having a little bit of a drought in West Hempstead, and you can see that it's dry in the upper reach. So what should be a perennial stream has become an ephemeral stream. Which because of the fluctuations in groundwater in the water table, which is already pretty close to the base of this particular dry valley as it is. So streams on Long Island have really taken a beating because between sewering and groundwater pumping, which is lowering the water table and depriving the streams of their base flow, you also have the issue of the progressive development and population of Long Island, which is sort of moved from west to east, has resulted in humans interfering in the natural hydraulic functioning of streams. So in this diagram here, the image on the left shows the Mill River watershed as it was in pre-colonial times, with headwaters fairly far up the glacial dry valley, and unimpeded flow down into the bay here. By the mid-1800s, in the central diagram, people built impoundments to create mill dams and mill ponds, and the Mill River is called the Mill River because it was famous for a whole series of small mill ponds that were created to generate water power, and also for ice harvesting in the wintertime. If you have a pond, you can let it freeze, and then you collect the ice in the wintertime and store it for use through the summer. Also for irrigation and for livestock. And then moving into the mid-1800s, a lot of these mill ponds were expanded into larger reservoirs because much of what is now Nassau County became Brooklyn's water supply. And then through the 20th century, as flow in the streams was impacted by groundwater pumping and sewering, and as more and more of the land was developed for housing, the streams just sort of started to disappear. So a lot of these streams that flow across southern Long Island are scarcely recognizable as streams anymore. What you see on the maps are a series of ponds, all of which are, you know, artificial impoundments. And in between the ponds, you often don't even see the stream because it's running through a culvert. And in the case of the Mill River, most of the extent of the Mill River, the former flow of the Mill River, where the town of Hempstead is now, where downtown Hempstead is, the stream's just not there anymore. It's completely underground. It's gone. There's in Malvern, the Pines Brook disappears for a half a mile or so because they built a high school over it, and they just buried the stream. It's running through a concrete culvert beneath the football field under the high school. So we've really drastically altered these streams. And again, one of the main reasons that so many of the streams, particularly in the western half of Long Island, were dammed up was to create a water supply for Brooklyn. Brooklyn had to abandon its groundwater supply by the mid-1800s because they overpumped the groundwater and pulled salt water in. And so their aquifers became contaminated with chloride. And so Plan B was to create an aqueduct to bring water from all of these ponds, many of which were expanded into reservoirs, and basically pump that water through a series of pipes and up to the Ridgewood Reservoir, where it was then distributed to Brooklyn, the city of Brooklyn. And that worked for 50 years or so, but eventually the population of Brooklyn grew to the point where the demand for water could not be supplied by this system, and the system was eventually abandoned. And so, you know, we have the remnants of Brooklyn's water supply in you know, Hempstead Lake State Park. That Hempstead Lake is, you know, was built as a water supply reservoir. Valley Stream, the pond there is an expanded mill pond. Jamaica Reservoir off to the left side of this image, that is called Baisley Pond now, and it's a big park in southern Queens. One interesting thing about the Baisley Pond reservoir is when they were digging out the original pond to expand it into the Jamaica Reservoir, they discovered the partial skeleton of a mastodon, American mastodon. And unfortunately, we don't have the bones. They found a good bit of the skull, I think most of the teeth, and some pieces of leg bone and ribs. And we don't have that skeleton because the workers took the teeth home as souvenirs and they threw the rest of it away. A little bit of paleontological trivia there. So we've reduced the flow in the streams that drain into the bays on Long Island, and we've impounded them to form a whole series of ponds and interrupted their continuous flow. And we've had a tremendous impact on the coastal ecosystem because our impoundments prevent fish from returning upstream to spawn. And there are historical runs of fish all along the south shore of Long Island. And we're talking about alewife and related species of fish, and certain types of trout, brook trout, which are known as salmonids, and eels. right? So fish, these fish that spend part of their life in saltwater and part of their life in freshwater are called diadromous fish. And diadromous, the word is from the Greek, it means to run through. So these are fish that run, through these streams, alternating their lives between fresh and saltwater. And there are two types of diadromous fish. You've got anadromous fish or anadromous fish, which live in saltwater but have to return to freshwater streams to reproduce. So your brook trout and your river herring, the alewives, are examples of these. These guys cannot complete their life cycles if they can't get upstream. So there's been, we've over the last 200 years, we've tremendously reduced the populations of these fish by preventing them from spawning. And then American eels are catadromous fish. The adult eel lives in the freshwater streams but returns to the sea and swims way out into the Sargasso Sea in the middle of the Atlantic to reproduce. And then the baby eels make their way back to the shoreline and make their way back upstream to complete their life cycle. So there's a big push on Long Island to try and restore the ability of these species to make their way back upstream and spawn. And many people in the ecological community would argue that we need to remove a lot of these dams and drain the ponds and restore the rivers to their original runs. But people get used to their ponds, and we like the ponds, and there are parks built around the ponds. So that's probably not an option in most cases. So what's being done is to install fish passages and fish ladders. There are already fish passages on parts of the Peconic and on the Carmen's River, Massapequa Creek in the Carles River, and then they're in the process of constructing some fish passages on the Mill River. One at Smith Pond and then another one at South Pond to allow the fish to get back up into these ponds so that they can spawn. So this photo that's coming up here shows the impoundment that forms Smith Pond, which is in Rockville Center, just north of Sunrise Highway and Merrick Avenue here. And it's not a very big dam. It's just a few feet, drop in elevation, actually a couple of feet in this case. But these fish can't get up over that. And if you go to any of these impoundments, where the first barrier to the fish moving upstream in mid-April or so, and drop a GoPro into the water, you see thousands and thousands of alewife just milling around trying to find their way upstream so they can spawn, and they can't. So they end up spawning only in the lower stretch of the river, and there's much higher mortality. If we can bring these fish back, we'll see a big impact on the marine ecosystem. These are the small fish that feed the larger fish, the game fish, the sport fish, the whales, the sharks, all of the marine life that we expect to see off in the Atlantic Ocean are dependent on these species. And then finally, to wrap up here, just a few words about the canoe trip on the Nissaqua River. So I believe you will there's two ways to canoe the Nissaqua, and it all depends on the tide, because the Nissaqua, the lower extent of the Nissaqua is a tidal estuary. If the tide is coming in, then what you want to do is put in at Nissaqua River State Park and paddle with the tide upstream and take out near where 25A crosses the stream. There's a small park up there. Or if the tide is going out, you put in up here and you ride the tide down and take out at Nissaqua River State Park. I believe on the canoe trip, you're going to put in up here and then you end up in the Nissaqua River State Park for a picnic. And one of the things after you put in, you'll paddle upstream a little bit to a beautiful mill pond and an impoundment. So you can see you'll see an example of one of these impoundments that was created to generate some water power, but which forms a barrier to the movement of fish up into the rest of the system here. If you're lucky, you might see some wildlife on the paddle down the Nissaqua River. So I just wanted to show a few examples of species that I've seen canoeing the Nissaqua River. In the lower stretch of the Nissaqua, where it widens out into a saltwater, mostly saltwater estuary, you may see some terrapins. There's a pretty good population of terrapins near the mouth of the Nissaqua. What you usually see are their little heads poking up out of the water near the shoreline, and then as you get close to them, they pull their heads under. But they're beautiful turtles. They are, really the only example we have of a brackish water turtle that inhabits the estuaries around Long Island. They've been heavily impacted by the turtle meat industry. So terrapins were drastically over harvested in the 1800s and well into the 20th century for their meat. And only recently has terrapin harvesting been severely curtailed in New York State. Another very common turtle species in the Nissaqua are snapping turtles, and usually when you see snapping turtles, you see them hauled out on the side of the river in the middle of the day, sunning themselves. And I took one trip down the Nissaqua River, and at one point along the river, I thought I started wondering, like, who dumped all of these old tires along the riverbank? And then I realized that those weren't old tires. They were really big snapping turtles that were sunning themselves. I've seen muskrats swimming along in the water as we've paddled by. Sort of a beaver-like rodent, much smaller than a beaver, of course. There are currently, I don't believe, any beavers living in the Nissaqua. Beavers are scarce on Long Island. They should be here, but they were extirpated for their fur, back in the 1800s, and have not made their way back to Long Island yet. But a species that has made its way back to Long Island is the river otter. River otters were extirpated from Long Island, and it's only in the last couple of years that they have made their way back. And apparently, they've kind of hopscotched from Connecticut to the islands that kind of form the North Fork here. They're very good swimmers, so they can cross stretches of Long Island Sound. Tom Dwyer mentions that beavers are found on Plum Island. I did not know that. But Mike Battini, who works with Seatuck Environmental Association, has documented the presence of otters on just about every river on Long Island now. There's a stream on Long Island that's large enough to support them, that has enough wild habitat to support them. So they are making a comeback, which is really cool. They're a lot of fun. All right, and there you go. That's my story. Let me unshare my screen here.
All right, we did get a couple of questions and comments already. Let me just see if I can scroll back up on them. Jill said, let's see, that this is a fantastic presentation, and I agree with her. Great job, Bret, as usual. Regina Bykov of PWGC asked, as there is more of a push to sewer larger areas in Suffolk County, how do you think that this will affect the groundwater supply? Rich Baldwin of Rising Resiliency already gave the practical answer of more graft and corruption. What's the scientific answer?
Well, so, I mean, that's where Rich raises an interesting point. The main reason why more of Suffolk County has not been sewered is because the Southwest Sewer Project was such a political disaster. I mean, I remember when I was growing up on Long Island, the headlines in Newsday about all of the graft and corruption and the organized crime, getting involved and siphoning all this money off. So So the Southwest Sewer District project left such an unpleasant taste in everyone's mouth that you couldn't apparently even say the word sewer in Suffolk County until relatively recently, and now because of the nitrate problem, and the really explosive growth of population in Suffolk County, people are talking about sewering the more densely populated parts of Suffolk County. And that will have the same effect on the groundwater supply that it had in Nassau County. If you were diverting groundwater through wells and then not allowing that water to recharge the system, because treated wastewater ends up being disposed of offshore, that is going to lower the regional water table. I just don't think there's any way around it. It points out why it is so important to encourage recharge wherever possible, and also to discourage the wasteful use of groundwater. And we just had a Ty Fuller of the Suffolk County Water Authority talk to a bunch of our students, and he brought up the fact that I think he said 2/3 of the pumping capacity in Suffolk County is needed to supply lawn sprinkling. That if people weren't irrigating their lawns, instead of needing 600 public supply wells, Suffolk County would only need 200 public supply wells. So that's a tremendous waste of groundwater. So we could sewer Suffolk County and make up for the loss of recharge by wasting less groundwater.
All right, we've had a few more kudos to you from Olivia, Alton, and George. Thanking you for the presentation. We have a question from Paul Matley. Should we anticipate any impact by global warming on water resources on Long Island?
Oh, that's an interesting question. There's sort of two angles to that. One angle is precipitation. And I think most of the models suggest that we may see an increase in precipitation, although it's going, it might not be as evenly distributed throughout the year as it has been traditionally, and the precipitation might come in more intense pulses. And I'm not sure, I don't know if we get fewer, more intense rainfall events, I don't know how much of an impact that might have on recharge. Long Island is, the question, of course, is, if you have a more intense rainfall event, is more of that water going to end up discharging along the coastline instead of recharging into the aquifer, or will it sit around if it's not recharging fast enough and evaporate? I don't know. That's a good question.
Well, and maybe could you relate that maybe to what you just spoke of before with the sprinkling, use of water for sprinklers?
Well, my experience with sprinkling is that people don't pay any attention to whether or not it's raining. That the sprinkler system's on automatic, and so I've got neighbors and on my block, sprinkler systems are running when it's pouring rain. So I don't know that would be an issue. The other issue, of course, is sea level rise, and as sea level rises, that will move the freshwater saltwater interface inland to some degree. And I don't know how much of an impact that's going to have on our groundwater resource on Long Island. It might become an issue for wells that are located close to the coast. But it's certainly something that needs to be thought about.
All right, some more thanks from Mary Kate Conlon, Michael and Jessica McCairn, Stephanie Davis. I'm not sure who Wolfert is. I'm thinking Michelle, but I could be wrong on that. We have another question from Regina Bykov. Have there been any recent studies about recharge?
Well, that groundwater shed map that I showed, that I'm at a loss to tell you exactly what study that came from. I'd have to track it down. And maybe somebody knows, but that, you know, I think that that has come out of a recent attempt to model in great detail the, you know, the fate of recharge water on Long Island.
Okay, we have another question from Ivy. When we have wet seasons, do the post-glacial dry valleys regenerate? Do they become active again, or are they eternally dry?
Well, they you know, basically, if you raise the water table, the headwaters of the stream will advance northward, further up the dry valley. But you know, probably not much. I mean, unless you really raise the water table a lot.
Okay, and Ivy suggested that maybe USGS would have some information on some studies.
I think maybe I think it was the USGS that produced that groundwater table map. I think that's where we got it from.
Paul Lagerin also said, thank you, great graphics. Stephen Kaplan as well. Does anybody else have any other questions? And you feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask the question yourself. Anybody else? Last call. All right, I think, Chris, are you ready with some questions?
Yeah, time to test your knowledge if you were paying attention. We have 3 questions. Try to answer them in the chat box. I think the answers are probably, you know, 2 or 3 words will get the, will suffice. But anyway, let's try this. Okay, question number 1. Why are most valleys on the North Shore of Long Island devoid of streams? After folks get finished answering, I'll let Bret answer that one. Because I had the question, so I have the answers.
And actually, while people are still answering, there was another question. Bret, can we share these slides with everybody?
Yeah, I can. I'm happy to share the presentation.
Okay, thank you.
I can convert it to PowerPoint, and anybody is welcome to use it if you would find it useful.
And as just as a side to that, you know, all these presentations are recorded and available to watch on the LIAPG website via YouTube. So you can go back and look at all the things we've done over the last 3 or 4 years. Well, maybe not 4, but 3. All right, I think we've got number of answers. So Bret, you wanna enlighten us on this one? I think everybody got it.
I think everybody got it. So the land surface of the North Shore of Long Island is elevated because it's the thickest part of the outwash plain and or the moraine, and the valleys on the North Shore, particularly Western Long Island, tend to be tunnel valleys, and they simply do not intersect the water table. The water table is too low.
Cool. All right, next question.
Oh, your keys.
Why has stream flow been more severely impacted by development in Western Long Island than Eastern Long Island? Yep. That looks like that's about it. Bret, you want to enlighten?
So I would argue that it's mostly the difference in sewering. So you have so much less recharge in Western Long Island because of the extensive sewering. And so there's the lower water table and less base flow.
Cool. All right. Third question. What are some of the negative impacts of stream impoundments on the aquatic ecology of Long Island? Oh, that looks like that's about it on those answers. I think everybody's spot on.
Yep.
Bret,
Yep.
Bret, you want to respond to that?
Well, it's it's the impoundments prevent these very important diadromous fish species from completing their life cycles, and that cuts off the food chain at the base for the larger marine species. It's also a problem for if you like fishing. Brook trout like cold water, and the water that sits in all these ponds heats up. So there are very few streams on Long Island now that can support brook trout, which is a popular game fish species.
Well, all right. Bret, I have to say, as usual, thank you. Outstanding job. And you can see from the commentary, everybody really enjoyed it. It was enriching. I use that word carefully. And I think that, we will always be so appreciative of you coming out and supporting us and doing these very much. So thank you for that. The last thing I'll say is that the registration for the trip and the picnic is still open until Wednesday. If anybody else would like to come out, it's a great deal. We're footing, LIAPG has a little extra money, and we're footing the bill for some, catered food. If you're concerned about that, we're not cooking. We thought getting catered food from a professional, kitchen would be more appropriate, and for people being comfortable with the current COVID situation and all that. So it looks to be a good time. Pray for good weather. And like I said, if you'd like to, sign up still, we'd love to see more people. Anybody have anything else, or shall we conclude and adjourn?
Just a thank you to Bret.
Yeah.
My pleasure. Anytime.
I'd actually like to know where Scott Yannick is right now, unless he dropped off already. It looked like he's been boating somewhere. Maybe he's already on the Nissaqua.
He's practicing.